You know that one decision that cuts your life in two, before and after, and you don't get to go back. That's where Keanu was standing that night, in a smoky back room above Seoul, with Sandra on her knees and a Korean crime boss watching him like a man studying a broken toy. The room felt too small for all the eyes inside it. Glasses clinked softly somewhere behind Keanu, a lazy jazz track leaked in from the club downstairs, and above everything was the low hum of neon lights vibrating against the ceiling. Sandra's red dress was torn at the shoulder, a thin line of blood at her lip, but her eyes were still sharp, searching his face like she could find a way out just by reading him. Two men held her by the arms. Their grips were tight, but she didn't flinch. She only stared at Keanu, and in that stare was every quiet morning, every shared joke, every secret they thought the world would never touch. Across from them, at a polished round table, sat Minjun. People in the city whispered his name like a warning, though most had never seen his face. Tonight he looked almost bored, a silk shirt half open, a gold ring catching the light every time he tapped his fingers. He held a cigarette between two fingers, but it had burned almost to the filter, forgotten. His eyes were fixed on Keanu with calm, careful interest, as if he were watching the final move of a game he knew he'd already won. "You surprise me," Minjun said in smooth, measured English. "Most men would be screaming by now, begging, 'You're very quiet, Keanu.'" Keanu swallowed, his throat dry. He could feel his own pulse in his ears. He had never liked violence. Even now, with four armed men around him and Sandra trapped a few steps away, he kept his hands open at his sides, not raised to fight, not raised to surrender, just open like maybe this could still be talked through. That was who he was, a translator, a mediator, a man people hired to calm the room, not set it on fire. "That girl you took," Keanu said, keeping his voice steady. "The one who ran from your people, where is she?" A faint smile touched Minjun's lips. Still thinking about other people, interesting. Sandra's breath hitched. Keanu heard it. The girl's name was Hana, 17, scared. She had stumbled into their tiny language school 3 weeks earlier with bruises on her wrists and eyes that wouldn't stay in one place for more than a second. Sandra had been the first to hold out a cup of tea without asking any questions. Keanu had watched Hana's shaking hands wrap around the mug, and something in his chest had tightened. They hadn't planned to get involved. They had only planned to be kind. "Just stay with us until it's safe," Sandra had told Hana that first night. "You don't owe us anything, just rest." But kindness had a way of pulling hidden strings. 2 nights later, men had forced their way into the building. Windows broken, desks overturned. Hana gone. The police report had gone nowhere, and the threats had started. A phone call in the middle of the night. A picture of Sandra walking home, sent to Keanu's phone with no message because the message was obvious. Now here they were. Minjun leaned back in his chair, the leather creaking softly. "You know what I like about you, Keanu? You don't pretend to be a hero. You told my men you just want everyone to walk away alive. I respect that. It's humble." He pointed with the dying cigarette toward Sandra. "But that is your weakness." Sandra struggled against the hands on her shoulders. "Don't listen to him," she said. Her voice shook, but her eyes didn't. "Keanu, don't you dare listen to him." Keanu wanted to cross the space between them and pull her up. He wanted to put her behind him, face the guns, do something that looked like courage instead of this sick, careful stillness. But he had seen enough violence to know how quickly bodies hit the floor. The men around Sandra weren't nervous. They were relaxed, like they had done this so often it had become routine. If he lunged, if he shouted, if he did anything too fast, someone would die before he even reached her. Minjun ground the cigarette out in a crystal ashtray, the smoke curling up between his fingers. "I'm going to give you a choice," he said, as if he were offering dessert. "One I don't give often. Consider it a reward for moral consistency." Keanu met his eyes. "You don't have to do this." "Of course I don't," Minjun replied. "But I will, because people need to understand what happens when they take what belongs to me. You hid the girl, you involved yourself, that offended me. And yet I am a businessman, I see value in you." He nodded to one of his men, who stepped forward and placed a small black pistol on the table. The metal gleamed under the chandelier. It looked cold even from where Keanu stood. "Here is the choice," Minjun said. "Option 1, you take this gun. You work for me for 1 year, translation, negotiation, sometimes other tasks. And tonight, to show your loyalty, you kill the man I point to. a stranger to you, a lesson to everyone watching. Keanu felt his stomach twist. I'm not a killer. That is what every killer says before they start. Minjun's smile didn't reach his eyes. Option 2. He paused, letting the silence stretch long enough that the music from downstairs seemed to grow louder. You turn around, you walk away, you never look for Sandra again, you never speak to her, never send anyone to help her. You erase her from your life. If you do that, she lives. She goes free. The girl too, Hana. Both walk out of here untouched, I give you my word. Sandra's eyes widened. No, she whispered. No, don't you believe him, Keanu. One of the guards tightened his grip on her shoulders. Quiet, he hissed in Korean. Keanu's chest felt tight, like the air in the room had thickened into something he had to push through. His mind raced, searching for lies in Minjun's offer. This man had burned businesses to the ground for less than what Keanu had done. But he had also built an empire on his reputation. If he said someone walked, they walked. Fear depended on trust too. You expect me to believe you'll just let them go? Keanu asked. You misunderstand. Minjun folded his hands. I expect you to believe I am exactly the kind of monster people say I am. If you take the gun and refuse to shoot, I kill her myself. If you agree to work for me and then try to run, I find every person you've ever cared about. If you walk away and then return for her, I will make her last minutes very slow. His gaze sharpened. But if you walk out that door and keep walking, if you let her go like a man cutting off his own arm to escape a trap, I will keep my promise. You will never see them again, but they will live. The room seemed to shrink. Keanu could hear his own breathing now, loud and uneven. Sandra shook her head, tears starting to form in her eyes. She hated crying in front of strangers, he knew that. He had held her once after a bad day at the school when she had said, I can take anything as long as nobody sees me break. Now everyone was watching. Keanu, she said, forcing the words through a tight throat, look at me, look at me. He did. In her eyes he saw the life they had built with almost nothing. The tiny apartment with the leaky window. The plant she kept on the sill even though it refused to bloom. The late nights grading papers. The way she would fall asleep with a pen still in her hand. He saw the first time they had met, years ago, both working at a hospital in another country, both tired, both stubbornly kind in a world that kept giving them reasons not to be. Don't do this, she said. If you walk away, they own you for the rest of your life. You'll hear my voice in every empty room, you know that. His throat burned. If I stay, he managed, they own our lives for the rest of however long we have left. Minjun watched them with clinical interest, like a doctor tracking a patient's heartbeat on a monitor. Love is beautiful, he said softly, but also very inconvenient, isn't it? Keanu took a slow breath, then another. He tried to imagine pulling the trigger on a stranger. He tried to imagine living every day knowing he had ended a life to save his own. He had seen enough broken men to know what that would turn him into. Whatever part of him believed in helping people, in standing between the weak and the cruel, would die in that back room even if his body walked out. He also tried to imagine a world without Sandra, without her voice, without the way she always found something kind to say about people who didn't deserve it. Could he really choose to cut her out of his life like she had never existed? His hands shook. He curled them into fists to hide it. You told me once, Sandra said, tears slipping free now, that courage isn't always fighting. Sometimes it's staying, sometimes it's holding on. She tried to smile. Be brave now, stay. Keanu closed his eyes for a moment. In the darkness behind his lids, he saw Hana's frightened face. He saw the kids at the language school, watching Sandra with the kind of trust only children could give. He saw, with a horrible, cold clarity, what Minjun would do if he refused either option. A bullet, a scream, 2 bodies on the floor, maybe more. Maybe everyone in this room who wasn't useful anymore. When he opened his eyes, something in them had changed. Not hardness exactly, something more fragile and more painful than that. Acceptance. Your decision, Minjun asked quietly. Keanu took one step forward. For a second, everyone tensed, expecting him to reach for the gun. Instead, he stopped just short of the table and looked at Sandra like he was memorizing her. I'm sorry, he whispered. Her face crumpled. No, Keanu, don't. He turned away from her. Each step toward the door felt like walking off the edge of a building. The men by the wall shifted, surprised but silent. No one tried to stop him. That was the twisted mercy in Min Jun's rule. A deal was a deal, even when it tore people apart. At the doorway, Keanu paused. His hand rested on the frame, knuckles white. He didn't look back because he knew if he saw her eyes again, he would run to her and everything would end in blood. In the heavy, breathless silence, Sandra's voice broke across the room, raw and cracking. "If you walk out," she said, "you don't get to be the man I loved anymore. Do you understand? You don't get to carry me like a sad story you tell yourself. You let me go for real." Keanu's shoulders trembled. For a heartbeat, it seemed like he might turn around. Even Min Jun leaned forward, fascinated. Then Keanu lowered his hand, opened the door, and stepped into the hallway without a word, leaving Sandra behind, her fate hanging on the promise of a crime boss and the shattering echo of the man she trusted choosing to walk away. The night swallowed Keanu as soon as the door closed behind him. The bass from the club downstairs thumped through the floor, distant and hollow, like a heartbeat he was walking away from. Cold air hit his face in the alley, sharp with rain and cigarette smoke. For a long moment he just stood there, palms pressed to the rough brick, trying to steady the shaking in his hands. He had chosen. That word felt poisonous in his chest. Chosen, as if there had been anything in that room that resembled a real choice. His feet finally moved, not because he knew where to go, but because standing still hurt too much. He walked without direction, past late-night food stalls and taxis, past laughing couples who had no idea that, only a few blocks away, lives had been torn apart in a single quiet conversation. By the time he reached the river, his legs ached. The city lights shimmered on the dark water, stretching and breaking with every small wave. Keanu leaned on the railing, breathing hard. In his mind, he kept seeing Sandra's face at the moment he turned away, the disbelief, the pain, and something worse than hatred, something like permanent loss. He had wanted to believe there would be a day when he could explain. Standing there now, he understood there might never be a version of the story where his choice did not sound like betrayal. "You wanted them to live," he whispered to himself. His breath came out in pale clouds. "You wanted them to live." The words didn't comfort him, but they anchored him. Hana's terrified eyes flashed across his memory. The thin blue bruises around her wrists, the way she had clung to Sandra's hand. If he had stayed, if he had reached for that gun, there was every chance both of them would already be dead. He knew that, knowing it didn't make the weight on his chest any lighter. Keanu stayed by the river until the sky turned pale at the edges. When the cold started to bite through his jacket, he made another decision. Not as dramatic as the one in the upstairs room, but one that would stretch across the rest of his life. If he had traded love for their safety, then he would spend whatever years he had left trying to make that trade mean something. No more neutral ground, no more helping from the sidelines. If he couldn't go back for Sandra, he would go forward for every other Hana the world tried to swallow. 2 weeks later, he left Seoul. He moved quietly through cities that blurred together. Manila, Bangkok, Lisbon. He took jobs with small NGOs and church basements and underfunded shelters, places where nobody asked too many questions about why a talented translator was willing to sleep on a cot and work 16-hour days for almost nothing. He taught language classes to women with haunted eyes, sat with lawyers building cases against men whose names were spoken only in whispers, filled out endless forms in languages most survivors couldn't read. He never talked about Sandra. He never mentioned Min Jun. On paper, he was just another volunteer who seemed older than his years, the kind of man who listened more than he spoke and flinched slightly whenever a door slammed too hard. News from Korea reached him in fragments. A friend in Seoul sent a single careful message months after he left. "The woman and the girl from your case, both alive, both out of the country, that's all I can safely say." Keanu stared at the lines until they blurred. Alive. Out. He exhaled a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding since that night. That same evening, an anonymous email appeared in the inbox he used for field work. No subject line, no signature, just 3 sentences. "You walked away. She lived. Now what are you going to do with that?" He read it 10 times, trying to hear a voice behind the words. Was it Sandra? Was it some twisted joke from someone in Min Jun's orbit? Or just a coincidence from another case? He would never know. But the question in the last line dug its hooks into him and didn't let go. While Keanu moved from border to border, Sandra tried to remember how to breathe. The night Min Jun released her, rain hammered the courtyard outside like the sky was furious on her behalf. 2 cars waited with engines running. Hana stood close to Sandra, shaking. Their clothes had been returned, their phones wiped, their bags packed by someone else's hands. Min Jun himself watched from the doorway, a dark silhouette against warm yellow light. "I am not merciless," he said, as if he needed her to understand that. "You kept something that belonged to me, you paid, now you leave, new passports, new lives. If you ever speak my name to anyone who can hurt me, if you ever let that man know where you are," his eyes hardened. "You remember what I promised." Sandra held his gaze, refusing to look away. "You don't need to threaten me with Keanu," she said quietly. "He already did what you wanted." For the first time, something like amusement flickered on Min Jun's face. "Love makes people do very practical things," he replied. "Go before I change my mind." The car doors shut with heavy finality. As they pulled away from the compound, Hana clutched Sandra's arm so tightly it hurt, but Sandra didn't pull back. She stared out at the wet streets and told herself, again and again, that she would not cry for a man who had left her in that chair. But the tears came anyway, hot and relentless, burning tracks down her cheeks as the city lights smeared past the windows. For weeks after they landed in a different country, Sandra lived in slow motion. She checked the locks 3 times every night. She woke up sweating, hearing Keanu's voice saying "I'm sorry" on a loop that made her want to scream. When well-meaning strangers asked where she was from or what had brought her there, she smiled politely and changed the subject. Inside, something that had always been open and generous began to harden around the edges. Then one afternoon, she found Hana sitting alone on a stairwell, hugging her knees, staring at nothing. The girl's shoulders shook with silent sobs. Sandra sat down beside her and didn't say anything until Hana finally spoke. "If he hadn't helped me," Hana whispered, "I would still be there, you would still be fine. I ruined your life." Sandra's first instinct was to argue, to insist that none of this was Hana's fault, that the blame belonged only to the men who had built their lives on other people's pain. But what came out instead was something deeper, truer, forged from the wreckage of everything she'd lost. "You didn't ruin my life," she said softly. "You showed me what my life is for." Hana looked up, confused. "We were safe," Sandra continued. "We could have stayed that way, closed, comfortable, pretending not to see, but we met you and now we know. So we don't get to go back to pretending even if it hurts. That's not a curse, Hana, that's a calling." In that moment, a new shape formed around Sandra's broken heart. It wasn't forgiveness yet, not for Keanu, not for herself, but it was purpose. If the price of seeing the world clearly was this much pain, then she would not waste it. Years passed, marked not by holidays or birthdays, but by the steady stream of faces crossing the threshold of the safe houses where Sandra worked. She learned laws and loopholes. She learned how to sit still while someone told the worst story of their life. She learned how to be fierce in courtrooms and gentle in kitchens, how to keep herself small when survivors needed space, and loud when authorities tried to minimize what had been done. She never tried to find Keanu. She heard whispers that he was out there somewhere doing similar work, and each rumor cut and healed at the same time. He had chosen his path, she would choose hers. The part of her that had once been a woman in love became something else, a woman on a mission. Some nights she caught herself imagining what she would say if she ever saw him again, and her chest would tighten. Then she would turn back to whatever case file lay open on the table and keep going. One winter evening, in a crowded shelter in Madrid, a new girl arrived shaking so badly that her teeth chattered. She spoke broken Korean and halting Spanish. When Sandra, switching languages gently, asked who had hurt her, the girl's answer made the room tilt. "A Korean boss," she said, voice barely a whisper. "They call him Min Jun." Heat rushed to Sandra's face, cold to her fingers. She forced her voice to stay calm. "And where is he now?" The girl swallowed. "Bigger now," she said. "Different countries, rich friends, but someone inside is sending information. They say a woman in a red dress keeps betraying him." Sandra's heart stumbled. She hadn't worn red in years. She reached for the girl's trembling hands and held them steady. "Then we're not done with him," she said, her voice low and fierce. Not yet. And in a quiet corner of another city, unaware of the story that had just begun to circle back toward him, Keanu checked his email and opened a new message from an international task force with a subject line that made his hands go cold. Korean syndicate expansion, requesting your expertise. Rain hammered the tin roof of the safe house in Manila as Keanu read the report for the third time. Names, dates, bank transfers, shell companies moving money across oceans. At the center of the web, like a spider that had grown fatter and smarter, was a familiar name, Min Jun. Keanu's jaw tightened as he traced the lines of connection with his finger. He had spent years trying to dismantle smaller networks, always from the edges, always as the quiet support man. This was different. This was the man whose shadow stretched over his worst memory, the man whose voice still walked the hallways of his sleep. An agency contact had written in the margin of the dossier, "We suspect an internal leak. Someone close to him is feeding us fragments. Whoever it is, they're careful and very brave." There was a code name scribbled beside that note, Red. Keanu stared at the word, his mind flickering back to the ruined strap of a red dress under harsh chandelier light. It was coincidence, he told himself. It had to be. But the coincidence wrapped itself around his heart and squeezed. He accepted the assignment. In the months that followed, his days blurred into a rhythm of interviews, late-night calls, and long hours hunched over maps and spreadsheets. He became the quiet center of a storm of information. Survivors described safe houses they had passed through, the logos they had seen on invoices, the accents of men who had threatened them. Aid workers fed him rumors. Lawyers sent sealed records. Every detail mattered. What made the work strangely haunting was how often different sources mentioned the same thing. Someone on the inside, a woman slipping notes to desperate drivers, leaving USB sticks in public lockers, redirecting girls at the last moment toward safe exits arranged by unknown allies. "She never gives her real name," one rescued woman said through a translator. "But she looks at you like your mother would look at you if your mother had power." Keanu listened, aching. He refused to ask whether the insider was Sandra. He felt deep in his bones that he had lost the right to wonder. But the possibility hovered at the edge of his awareness like a ghost. While he traced Min Jun's empire on a map, Sandra walked into its heart. After hearing the name again in Madrid, she could have chosen safety. She could have stayed in the shelter, guiding survivors through paperwork and therapy sessions, living a good, quiet life far from the man who had once held her fate in his hands. But the knowledge that Min Jun had only grown stronger burned in her like acid. "He doesn't get to write the ending," she told Hana one night as they washed dishes side by side. "Not for us, not for the others." Hana's eyes filled with fear. "You're talking like you want to go back," she said. "Sandra, no, we got out, don't walk into his world again." Sandra dried her hands slowly. "I'm not walking in as his prisoner this time," she said. "I'm walking in as his problem." It wasn't bravado. It was a cold, measured resolve that had grown in her over the years. She had learned enough about how men like Min Jun operated to know where they were vulnerable. Their money, their secrets, their dependence on people who seemed invisible. She began quietly reaching out to contacts. A lawyer here, a social worker there, building a small web of her own. Eventually, she got what she was looking for. A job offer doing translation and community outreach for a charity front in Europe that every serious investigator suspected was tied to Korean organized crime. Her references were impeccable, built from real years in real shelters. Nobody questioned why a woman so qualified would accept such dangerous work for such modest pay. They underestimated the power of someone working for something other than money. Inside the organization, Sandra moved carefully. She smiled. She helped. She made herself indispensable. She never raised her voice. People told her things without realizing they were doing it. Schedules, cargo routes, which donors insisted on cash. At night, in her small apartment, she wrote it all down and found safe ways to pass it along to the task forces she trusted. Her code name was not her choice. The first time an encrypted message came back addressed to Red, she snorted softly. The universe, it seemed, had a dark sense of humor. She considered correcting them. Then she decided to leave it. Let the past leave its fingerprints. She was not hiding from what had made her stronger. Somewhere deep within an international database, Keanu found her. He didn't know it at first. All he saw was a pattern. Reports from Red fit too perfectly with other data he was compiling. Routes she mentioned matched bank transfers he had tracked. The timing of her warnings aligned with his own projections. Together, their anonymous work became a kind of long-distance conversation, each building on what the other had done, neither knowing the other's name. The agent coordinating both sources, a tired Spanish woman named Lucia, often shook her head in quiet awe. "I don't know who you are," she told Keanu over coffee one night, "but whoever Red is, the two of you think the same way. It's like you're dancing without seeing each other." The words hit him like a physical blow. He covered it with a small, non-committal smile, but inside he felt the ground shift. The idea that, somewhere out there, he might be working side by side with the woman he had once walked away from was almost too much to bear. The turning point came when something went wrong. A mid-level trafficker was arrested in a small port city, carrying a phone full of messages he should have deleted. Most of them were dull logistics, but buried among them was a fragment that made Lucia call Keanu in the middle of the night. "Read this," she said, forwarding the translation. "Tell me what you see." The message was from one of Min Jun's closest lieutenants. "Boss suspects there is a woman leaking details. He says the red ghost is real. Says we let her walk once. Won't make that mistake again. Plans an accident at the Valencia gala. No survivors if he confirms." Keanu's breath caught on the second sentence. "We let her walk once." His mind slammed back to the rain-slick street, the car doors closing, Sandra's profile in the dark window. Suddenly, the shadowy figure called Red was not just probably Sandra. She was almost certainly Sandra, and Min Jun had finally connected the dots. "What's the Valencia gala?" Keanu asked, his voice too calm. "Charity event," Lucia replied. "Big donors, art, wine, speeches about saving the children while some of the guests are paying to hurt them. We've suspected a connection for years. Red is scheduled to work there." Lucia hesitated. "You think he knows who she is?" Keanu closed his eyes for a brief, searing moment. "He knows enough," he said, "and if he's calling her someone he let walk, yes, he knows." They sat in silence, the weight of it heavy through the phone line. "We can pull her out," Lucia said finally. "Shut down her access, warn her, but if we spook him too early, he'll vanish again. There's a narrow window here. If she stays in place, we might get him. Really get him. Evidence, witnesses, maybe even him in cuffs." Keanu stared at the wall, at the map where red lines stretched across continents like old scars. He had spent years telling himself that the best way to honor his terrible choice was to save as many others as he could. Now, faced with the possibility that the woman who had paid the highest emotional price for his decision was about to pay with her life, that equation shattered. "If we do nothing," he asked quietly, "will she know she's walking into a trap?" Lucia hesitated. "I don't think so." A dull roar filled his ears. The promise he had made walking away, that he would not go back, would not draw fire toward her again, pressed against the part of him that could not bear the thought of losing her while he watched from another continent. Fear and love and guilt twisted together until he could hardly breathe. "Lucia," he said, his voice rough, "I need to be at that gala." "You're not Field," she protested. "Your analysis, and you're too close to this. I can hear it in your voice." "Exactly," he replied. "I know how he thinks. I know what he threatened once. He won't expect to see me there, and if he does, maybe he'll focus on me instead of her." There was a long pause. "You understand what you're saying?" Lucia asked. "If he connects you to Red, he will break every rule he's ever had about keeping promises." Keanu looked at his own reflection in the dark window, almost not recognizing the man staring back. Older, more lined, but with a steadiness that hadn't been there the night he ran. "Then let him come for me," he said. "I walked away once to save her life. If the price of making that count is walking back in and risking mine, I'm done hesitating." 2 days later, a plane lifted off into a gray European morning, carrying Keanu toward a city where crystal glasses would clink, cameras would flash, and somewhere under soft music and polite conversation, a silent war would reach its breaking point. As he tightened his seatbelt, his phone buzzed with a final encrypted message from Red, forwarded automatically through Lucia's system. It was a small update, nothing unusual on the surface, about a change in catering staff and security rotation at the gala. Keanu read it 3 times, feeling every unspoken word between the lines. Somewhere in that same city, Sandra pressed send on that message, unaware that the man she had once begged to stay was flying toward her, choosing this time not to run. Soft jazz floated through the high-ceilinged hall, mingling with the clink of glass and the low murmur of expensive conversation. Chandeliers spilled warm light over polished marble, turning the Valencia Gala into something almost unreal. Too polished, too bright, a perfect mask over something rotten. Sandra moved through the crowd with a tray of glasses, her red staff badge glinting against a simple black dress. The organizers had wanted her to wear one of the shimmering gowns set aside for hostesses, but she had smiled and declined, citing comfort and professionalism. She would not let this place dress her like a decoration. She was here to watch, to listen, to remember. Her earpiece crackled softly as Lucia's voice murmured in her ear from the surveillance van outside. "Cameras are live. Audio is good. Breathe, Red, in and out." "I'm fine," Sandra whispered, though her heart was beating too fast. "Tell me when you see him." "We will," Lucia said. "Stay natural. He won't risk a scene early. Men like him prefer quiet accidents near the end of the night." Sandra inhaled slowly, let it out. Around her, guests laughed and complained about flight delays, about new tax laws, about the poor quality of the champagne compared to last year. As she refilled their glasses and offered practiced smiles, she catalogued faces, checked off names in her mind, noting who glanced too often at the exits, who scanned the room like they were waiting for someone more important. Near the stage, a large screen displayed heartwarming images of children in crowded classrooms, faces blurred for protection. Sandra's stomach turned at the hypocrisy. She knew how thin the line was between photo-op charity and quiet exploitation. That was why she was here. If tonight went well, this would be the last gala this organization ever held. On the far side of the room, a tall man in a dark suit stepped in from the terrace, pausing just under the chandelier. For a moment, Sandra only registered the way people instinctively made space around him, though nobody seemed to know why. Then he turned his head, and the world narrowed to a single point. "Keanu." The tray in her hands wobbled. A glass tipped, spilling champagne onto her fingers. She caught it before it fell, her practiced reflexes kicking in, but inside something crashed hard. Years of carefully built distance shattered in an instant. He looked older, leaner, the angles of his face sharper under the soft lights. There was a small scar near his jaw she didn't remember. His eyes swept the room once, alert and measuring, before moving on. He hadn't seen her. Yet. In her ear, Lucia swore softly. "You didn't tell me you knew our new consultant personally." Sandra swallowed, forcing her voice steady. "I didn't know who he was." "Do you trust him?" Lucia asked quickly. 1,000 memories flickered through Sandra's mind. Coffee at dawn before classes, his quiet laugh when she made a terrible joke, the weight of his apology in that smoky room, the sound of a door closing behind him. "I trust what he's doing here," she said finally. "And I trust myself. That will have to be enough." She put the tray down on a nearby table, flexed her damp fingers, and slipped deeper into the crowd where she could watch both the doors and the man who had once walked away to save her. Keanu moved like a man expecting trouble but not inviting it, staying near the edges, talking briefly with a handful of guests and staff. He kept his expression neutral, but inside his thoughts raced. He had spotted Sandra in the first minute, his eyes drawn to her as if no time had passed at all. Seeing her alive, moving with purpose, nearly undid him. Part of him wanted to run to her, to fall at her feet and confess everything. Another part remembered clearly the cold promise in Min Jun's voice. "If you ever go back for her." He forced himself to stay where he was, heart pounding. He was not here to claim her. He was here to pull a trigger of a different kind. Through a small earpiece of his own, he spoke quietly. "Lucia, he's here, near the balcony east side, gray suit, no tie, 3 men around him." "Confirmed," Lucia replied. We see him, all teams hold positions. We need him on record, not just in the room. As the night deepened, the masks began to slip. Guests drank more, spoke louder. Keanu caught snatches of conversation, investments, shipments, favors owed. Sandra maneuvered closer to the informal cluster forming around the balcony, where the smokers and real decision-makers liked to gather. She knew from previous events that the most careless words were spoken where people thought they were half hidden. Then the air shifted. Even before she saw him, Sandra felt it. The slight tightening of shoulders, the way laughter dulled around the edges, like a predator had stepped into the clearing. Min Jun appeared as if he owned the room. Age had sharpened him. There was more silver at his temples, new lines around his eyes, but his gaze was as cool and assessing as ever. He wore no name tag, no mark of status, yet people rearranged themselves to be in his orbit. He spoke softly to the nearest donor, his hand resting lightly on the man's arm, and the donor laughed a little too hard at something that hadn't sounded like a joke. Sandra's body went cold, then hot. She kept her head slightly bowed, the picture of attentive staff, while every muscle screamed to run. Instead, she stepped closer, pretending to wipe a small spill from the balcony rail. Her recorder, hidden in the cloth of her sleeve, hummed faintly. Keanu watched from the far side of the hall, jaw clenched. Every instinct urged him forward, but he stayed still, trusting the plan. Gather proof, let the authorities close in. He would only move if things went off script. They went off script faster than anyone expected. One of Min Jun's men leaned in, murmuring something too quiet to catch. Min Jun's eyes flicked briefly across the room, scanning faces. For a terrifying second, his gaze seemed to brush past Sandra without stopping. Then, as a waiter passed between them, he looked back, and this time his stare settled on her. Recognition hit like a physical blow. His expression didn't change. He smiled, even a small, polite curve of the lips, but his eyes had turned to ice. He set his drink down with careful precision and spoke a few words to the men beside him. Two of them peeled away, moving casually along the edge of the balcony, closing the distance between them and Sandra with predator's patience. "Lucia," Sandra breathed, "he's seen me." Static crackled, then Lucia's voice. "We're moving in faster than planned. Stay where people can see you. Don't let them isolate." The rest cut off as a burst of laughter from nearby guests drowned out the transmission. One of the approaching men, accidentally, bumped into Sandra, sending her stumbling toward the balcony rail. Another guest turned to apologize, blocking Lucia's line of sight from the outside cameras. Across the room, Keanu saw it, the subtle shift in posture, the way the men around Min Jun spread just enough to give their boss a clear view of the balcony. His heart lurched. He didn't think. He moved. Time fractured into sharp, clear pieces. Sandra's back hit the cold metal of the railing. A strong hand closed around her arm, fingers digging in with enough force to bruise. The man smiled down at her, his voice low and almost gentle. "Careful," he said, "long way down." Behind him, another man's hand dipped toward his jacket, where Keanu saw the outline of something he did not want to be: a gun in a room this crowded. The music swelled. People laughed, unaware that death was circling less than a meter away. Keanu crossed the last stretch of polished floor in a blur. He slammed into the man holding Sandra just as the second man's hand emerged from his jacket, not with a gun but with a small vial and a folded napkin, a quieter kind of murder. The impact knocked all three of them hard against the railing. Glass shattered. Someone screamed. The music stumbled, faltered, then stopped. For a split second, Sandra was pressed between two impossible realities. The memory of a man turning his back on her under a chandelier, and the feeling of that same man now shoving her behind him, taking the brunt of the blow. The vial slipped from the attacker's hand, shattering against Keanu's shoulder instead of Sandra's neck. A chemical sting hit his skin. He yanked Sandra away, shoving her toward the crowd. "Stay behind, people," he gasped. "Don't argue, just go." She stared at him, stunned. "Keanu." "Later," he said, eyes locked on the men regrouping. "If we get one." Security alarms wailed to life as plainclothes officers surged into the room, shouting commands in multiple languages. The carefully constructed illusion of a harmless gala crumbled into chaos. Some guests ducked under tables. Others tried to run, only to find exits blocked by uniformed police. Min Jun did not run. He stepped back from the balcony, lifting his hands slightly as if offended by the noise. His gaze moved from Sandra to Keanu, and for the first time that night, real emotion cracked his calm, something like dark amusement mixed with cold fury. "You," he said softly once he was close enough. No title, no name, just a recognition that burned. "You walked away, and yet here you are." Keanu's shoulder throbbed where the chemical had burned his skin, but he stood his ground. "I made a mistake," he said, his voice steady despite the pain. "I thought staying away would keep her safe. Turns out the only way to end this was to stop you." Police closed in around them, guns drawn. Lucia's voice shouted orders somewhere in the background. Someone read rights in rapid-fire Spanish. Someone else yelled for medics. Through it all, Min Jun watched Keanu and Sandra like they were the only two people in the room. "You could have lived a quiet life," he said. "Both of you, all you had to do was keep pretending." Sandra stepped forward before Keanu could answer. There was fear in her eyes, yes, but there was something else too. A hard, bright courage that had been forged in the years they'd spent apart. "You don't get to offer us quiet lives," she said. "You build your comfort out of other people's nightmares. If being safe means leaving girls like Hana to you, then I don't want safety." Her voice didn't tremble. It carried across the stunned crowd, hanging in the charged air. Min Jun tilted his head, studying her. "You were always inconvenient," he murmured. "Love makes people rash." "It also makes them brave," she replied. "But this," she gestured around at the officers, the cameras now pointed their way, the documents Lucia's team was already hauling in. "This isn't just about love, it's about every person you thought would stay too scared to speak." Keanu felt something loosen in his chest at her words, a knot he hadn't realized he'd been carrying since the night he left that room. He had spent so long punishing himself for his fear that he had forgotten fear and courage often walked together. The difference was what you did with them. When the officers finally snapped cuffs around Min Jun's wrists, he didn't resist. But as they led him away, he looked back over his shoulder. "This isn't the end," he said quietly, almost conversationally. "Even if I disappear, there will be others." Sandra met his gaze without flinching. "Then we'll still be here," she said. "The next time and the time after that." He was gone a moment later, swallowed by a crush of uniforms and cameras. In the aftermath, under harsh fluorescent lights in a makeshift medical station, Keanu sat on a folding chair while a paramedic cleaned the raw chemical burn on his shoulder. It hurt, but it was a clean, simple pain, honest in a way that emotional wounds rarely were. Sandra stood a few feet away, arms wrapped around herself, watching him with an expression he couldn't quite read. Exhaustion tugged at her features. There were faint shadows under her eyes that hadn't been there years ago, but she was still here, still standing. Finally, she spoke. "You came back," she said, 3 simple words, heavy with everything between then and now. Keanu swallowed. "I should have stayed the first time," he answered. "I thought walking away was the only way to keep you alive. I told myself it was courage, but it was fear and logic fighting over my heart. I've spent every day since trying to become the man you thought I was before that night." She looked down at her hands, then back up at him. "You broke something in me when you left," she said, honest and quiet. "I won't pretend you didn't. I had to rebuild without you." "You did," he said, pride and sorrow mingled in his voice. "I saw it tonight. You became the bravest person in the room." For a long moment, they simply breathed in the same space, the noise of police radios and distant chatter wrapping around them like a reminder that the world was still turning. "I'm not the same woman you walked away from," Sandra said. "I don't know yet who I am with you in the picture again." "I don't expect you to know," Keanu replied. "I don't expect anything, not forgiveness, not us. I just couldn't watch you risk everything while I hid behind a promise a monster made in a dark room. If there is any chance to help undo the damage I did, I will spend the rest of my life doing it. With you if you ever want that, or from far away if that's what you need." Tears filled her eyes, but they didn't fall. She stepped closer, close enough that he could see the small scar near her temple he'd never noticed before, the faint tension at the corner of her mouth when she was fighting emotions too big to name. "You're still explaining," she said softly. "You always were good with words." She reached out, hesitated, then rested her hand lightly on his uninjured shoulder. "But today you did something better than explain. You showed up." The contact was light, but to Keanu it felt like gravity returning to a drifting planet. "Do you hate me?" he asked, not as a demand, but as a man willing to live with whatever answer came. She thought about it, really thought. Finally, she shook her head. "No," she said. I don't fully understand, but I don't hate you. Maybe that's the bravest thing I've done yet." A faint, tired laugh escaped him. "Then maybe there's hope for both of us." Months slipped by. Trials began. Bank accounts were frozen. Quiet settlements were overturned as survivors, emboldened by the public fall of a man once thought untouchable, stepped forward to tell their stories. It was messy and slow and sometimes heartbreakingly unfair. Not every criminal was punished. Not every wound healed clean, but the tide had shifted, even if only a few inches. Keanu and Sandra found themselves working, cautiously, side by side. They co-led a small organization focused on long-term support for survivors. Education, therapy, job training, the unglamorous, necessary work that began after the headlines faded. Hannah, older now, joined them as a counselor, her quiet strength anchoring girls who couldn't yet imagine a future. Their personal relationship did not magically reset. Some days they moved like old friends, the easy rhythm returning for a few precious hours. Other days, a word or a memory would reopen old wounds, and they would retreat to separate offices, letting distance cool the heat of emotions that were still raw. They learned to give each other space, to apologize quickly, to sit with discomfort instead of fleeing it. One afternoon, as the sun poured soft light through the windows of their modest center, a new girl arrived. She stood just inside the doorway, backpack clutched to her chest, eyes darting around with that same mix of fear and stubbornness Sandra recognized instantly. Keanu walked over, his voice gentle. "Hi," he said. "You're safe here. My name is Keanu. This is Sandra. Do you want some water? Something to eat?" The girl studied them skeptically. "People say that a lot," she muttered. "Safe, then they change." Sandra stepped up beside him, her tone steady. "People can change," she said. "For worse or for better. I can't promise we'll never make mistakes, but I can promise we will fight for you, not use you." The girl's eyes flicked between them. "Why?" she asked. "Why do you care?" Keanu glanced at Sandra, then back at the girl. His answer came from some deep, earned place inside him. "Because a long time ago," he said, "someone gave us a choice to look away and stay comfortable or to see and never be the same again. We failed that choice in some ways. We're trying to do better now. And because you deserve people who don't run when it's hard." Sandra's hand found his almost without thinking. Their fingers intertwined. Not a grand gesture, but a quiet acknowledgement of everything they had survived, separately and together. The girl hesitated, then nodded once, sharp and small, as if she were allowing herself to believe in the possibility of goodness for the first time. She stepped fully into the room. As the door closed behind her, the noise of the street softened. Inside, the sounds of life filled the space instead. Papers rustling, a kettle humming on the stove, distant laughter from another room. Keanu and Sandra stood side by side, watching the girl sit down, watching another story begin. Not clean, not easy, but real. In that moment, with the sun warming their faces and the echo of old choices lingering like a distant storm, they both understood something simple and hard-won. Sometimes courage is walking away to save a life. Sometimes courage is walking back into the room that broke you and staying long enough to help someone else walk out.